Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen. Season 3, Episode 7, Navigating MLT Conversations with Others.
Okay, Eric, I thought we would revisit a topic we haven't talked about in a long time. The idea of navigating conversations about music learning, whether it's music learning theory in terms of like capital MLT, the formal music learning theory, or just general more about how people think music is learned. These are important conversations. You know, we have these conversations as music teachers with our colleagues, with other music teachers, teachers we work maybe under or for or with, and parents and students. And so there's all, you know, they're all kind of different in a sense. And I find that teachers specifically can get very biased and defensive about their own practices. And I think it's worth having a bit of a skill set because MLT is fringe in the sense that it's not common knowledge, right? And it goes deep. So once you understand it, you know, it's kind of like you realize you're in the matrix and no one else knows. And it can be hard not to really want to convince other people that there's really something here. But I think there's a respectful way to go about those conversations where you're not offending anyone and you're not conceding that you don't know what you're talking about. Because I think sometimes in these conversations, we can kind of end up at a place where everyone has to figure it out for themselves, or the it worked for me fallacy. You know, some teachers are like, well, I teach like this and it works for me, even though there's some big holes in that kind of logic. So, I mean, you've been in the MLT world a lot longer than I have been. So, like, I'm sure you've experienced this a lot, issues around this topic.
Well, what percentage of music educators just recognize the term audiation? And if they do, how deep are they in music learning theory? They just swap audiation for, the thing they know that happens when you make music. It has to go into the ear and you have to understand it. Mm-hmm. But, even among, if you include all the music learning theory people, a Gimmel or anybody who's taken a class in music learning theory or has been exposed to music learning theory inside of a general class on music methods, right? And we know music learning theory is not a method. And that's one tricky thing to navigate, because everything else fits inside the narrative of, Dalcroze is a method, Suzuki is a method, Orff and Kodai are methods. And then you've got your traditional method, learn your notes and lines and spaces and counting and do that, and then transfer that onto an instrument. So there's a huge communication gap. I think there's even a communication gap among music learning theory practitioners at some level.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the lingo in each one of these different systems and methods of learning music. I mean, we can say that music learning theory isn't a method, but they're definitely, whether you're comparing Suzuki to Orff or just standard, I use my, notation exercise books and plug along. Everyone has their own way of framing things and viewing things. And I think one of the most important things for people just knowing what audiation is it frames so much of the discussion in terms of how we should even go about learning music. Because if you don't have that piece of vocabulary and that concept of audiation properly installed into your paradigm, your goals and values as a music teacher are just completely different, right? Because most of the classical teachers I know, for example, they value sight reading. Like if they're a classical instrumental teacher, their goal is for pupils to be able to pick up a score, blast through it, obviously with good phrasing and everything like that. I'm not taking a cheap shot at it, but there's a value system that this like that kind of sight reading or decoding where the rhythm is very accurate, but maybe the tonal stuff is not super online. It's more about just executing on an instrument. That turns into a value that some teachers have. And if you look at that value charitably and say, okay, well, I want my students to be good like sight readers in this case. Therefore, we should start teaching them to decode music. And that's what the training programs look like. That's what the education looks like. And under that paradigm of that goal being, the thing you're trying to build up to, it makes sense why they would structure their curriculum in a way that starts with decoding, that starts with names of notes, that starts with all this other stuff. And I don't have anything majorly, I don't have a super specific bone to pick with that camp over any other camp. It's just that without this concept of audiation and how audiation is learned through patterns and all that kind of stuff, it just totally clouds the way you curriculum design, clouds the way you approach playing instruments, clouds the way you approach even listening to music. And even in things that are more subtle, like what's the difference between an MLT teacher teaching violin or guitar and a Suzuki teacher teaching violin or guitar? Because if you looked in two of those classrooms, there'd be a lot of things happening that look similar. There'd be students playing songs by rote and by memory and all that kind of stuff. But there might be subtle differences in little things that the teachers are getting the students to do that over the course of 5 or 10 years of education can have insane differences on where students end up.
So should we have a mock conversation?
As long as I can be the person that's against MLT.
How do you broach the subject?
Okay, so let's define, am I going to be, so let's say you're a music teacher, for example. We'll start there, but am I going to be your non-MLT informed colleague, student, or parent of a student? Who do you want me to be?
Well, parents are easier. You want to start there?
Ironically, I think parents are the easiest to deal with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think it's because they have less cognitive bias and rigidity in terms of what should be done and why. And so they're very open-minded in terms of like, that sounds like it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, most of the school uses notation to teach an instrument. And, right, so I'm talking to you as a parent now. It's like there's so many kids are taking lessons. The first thing they need to know, and you might have even learned this way too, is you learned every good boy does fine, FACE, and those were the lines and spaces of the treble clef, and they gave you this information so that you could look at the notes, and then you learned to count, so now you know that there's a way to decipher what's there on the page. And I said, what's missing when we teach you to do that is the same thing that's missing when I start talking German to you. You just don't have any, you can't give it any meaning unless you speak German. So where does this meaning come from? Well, because you know the alphabet, and German uses the same alphabet as our language, that doesn't mean that you can understand German. And
so Eric, my concern though is like I have little Stevie in your class, and he's 5 now, and he's not getting any younger, and I need him to get started on the serious, music education. And my sister-in-law has a master's in piano performance, and she says that Stevie should be learning how to read music right now while he's still young. But you're not teaching him to read music.
Well, I'll teach him when he's ready. I love that you have that that you want him to be able to read because that gives you access to all the masters. There's a lot of music that's written down that you want to be able to give him access to through reading. But the question is, do you want him reading with understanding, or you want him sounding out the words? And what I want to do is get him to where he has a vocabulary where he can make sense of what he's reading, versus somebody who will pluck out the tones or pluck out the rhythms and not necessarily put himself into the picture. He's interpreting what's on the page, and it's never going through the filter of, little Bobby or whoever you're, Stevie, whatever. I forget your kid's name already.
So that sounds great, but how come then the classes aren't very serious? How come there's so much singing and dancing involved and they're not really getting down to, serious learning?
Well, the most serious learning is done through play, and we rob the kids of play so much earlier. To the point that it's no fun. Anybody really loves going to first grade anymore? Who loves going to school?
So I think that's great. And I actually haven't had a lot of conversations with parents that take a very aggressive stance towards MLT. Usually just because the results speak for themselves after a year or two. I find that a lot of a lot of parents have musical histories in the sense that they played an instrument and gave up on it. And when they see their children or whatever excelling in music and playing music, like air quote, naturally, not sludging through notation, and like they can actually carry a tune basically in just common language. Parents like that.
Yeah.
Very much. And so, the proof is in the pudding concept that I've seen when students get a few wins on the instrument, even if they're just playing by rote at first, it is very validating for the student and the parent especially. And that seems to dissolve any overarching concerns about notation and all that kind
I
of
always
stuff.
tell parents regarding this same conversation that I want to spread the base out as wide as possible so that they can do much taller growth later, giving them a foundation that's bigger than if we start reading now, we don't have the same structure in place for his continued growth later. So this singing and dancing and playing and all this stuff that looks like fun, and it is fun, and it should be fun because we learn better when things are fun and engaging versus when you're taught information. And I just don't want to teach information. I want your child to be musical first, and the information will come as they develop their understanding. So I
think your point about fundamentals is really, just key. I'm reading a book right now by the guitar professor Christopher Berg. I was showing you Eric earlier off air. Practicing music by design. I believe that's the title. Forgive me, Christopher, if I butchered it. But he comes at it from a very technical perspective. Like, he makes the case that, especially with instruments like the violin and the guitar and the piano, you really need a technical foundation. And there's a fallacy that goes on in, I think, a lot of high-level music education and popular music education, that you can just get all the technique you need from pieces, right? And that's fine. I mean, some people, if you want to get to a certain level of playing, you can probably get what you need from pieces. But I think to really go into the virtuoso space, if you look at the masters that have come before, I mean, Liszt was putting in an insane amount of work on his technique. And so that's fine. I have nothing wrong with what Christopher is claiming. Technique is important. And I've actually been a convert. I'm a fan of more technical exercises on the guitar now than I've ever been. I think it is a good idea. But if we take this in the direction of audiation, what are the foundations of audiation? What's going to build that big foundation, that big base of vocabulary and patterns? And And that's what makes a musician is that
Yeah,
groundwork.
notation is severely limited when you consider all the possible permutations of expression. What percent can actually be put down on the page? Not very much. What kind of legato? What kind of staccato? Is it just spatial staccato, or is it short? Is it, all the different accents we come up with, and they're not descriptive enough.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm playing in a jazz band and the first trumpet player, I'm listening to the first trumpet player to see how they're articulating to match what they're doing, not what the page is. Right? I I I want to to match the ensemble's style, or in my case the trumpet
Mm-hmm.
section. What are they playing? And otherwise it doesn't, it otherwise there's different interpretations going on, and so it's not communicated well, whatever we're playing. It's not.
Sure. Yeah, and what we're dancing around here is that music is an oral art. We're playing with sounds. And if the foundation of your music making is not based off of playing with actual sound, or more specifically audiation based things, you're playing with audiation. I mean, what are we doing, right? You actually see the same exact issue unfolding in reading, like just reading English. The school system has become so hell-bent on teaching kids to read that they are not seeing the skill learning sequence of learning their language, their native
Get some
language.
vocabulary, be able to speak first, right? Get it.
Exactly. And there's some hilarious in the sense that it's comical, terrifying in the sense that it's robbing people of great education, that people are getting less education in a variety of subjects like science, history, games, sports knowledge, whatever. I mean, Daniel Willingham pointed out that, I believe it was Daniel Willingham, the learning psychologist. Basically, a kid that sucks at reading but knows a lot about baseball will read a story about baseball fine. But a kid that's air quote really good at reading but knows nothing about baseball will understand zero about what's going on in a story. And there's a great analogy for what's going on with music reading. If you have a really solid background in bebop, when you start reading bebop charts, it just makes sense. You're like, oh yeah, those are the sounds. But if you have no background in bebop and you try slogging your way through it, it's unlikely you're going to have a good time. And so I find parents are very receptive to this language analogy between learning a language and learning music, like more so than pretty much anyone, unless your colleagues are very um, open-minded or already on
Yeah.
this track. I mean, I one of the reasons I was so into MLT right off the bat is like I had already developed the core convictions that audiation was something. I just didn't have a word for it. And obviously I hadn't there's no details, but the core conviction that there's a thing when people really know what they're doing and are hearing music in their mind and understanding music. And so it was an easy convert. It's an easy
Yeah.
sell.
Yeah. So entering a conversation with a parent, there's already some common ground. We both want what's best for the kid. And so the entry into the conversation is a little bit easier, right? But when you're talking to a colleague who may not know anything about music learning theory or the term audiation or like that, you need to be invited into that conversation. You need to make that invitation, so that you can have a conversation. Like, why you can't just walk up to somebody and say, hey, I got something to tell you about music teaching.
I totally agree. And so, I mean, you're basically saying there should be a respectful entry point where you're not, jamming ideas down people that don't really want them. But a very, Eric, you can comment on this because we've both been in this situation. Sometimes, though, you're in a position where you work for somebody who's not impressed about the way you're doing things. And in that circumstance, you kind of do have to defend what you're doing in a different way. Like if I'm just talking to a random music teacher and they don't care what I think, sure, go ahead, do whatever you want to do. It's you are you, I am me, let's have a great conversation if we can. But if you don't really want to engage in this topic, no harm done. But when you work underneath someone that's like, hey, I want you teaching decoding, I want you doing this, you work at my music school or God knows what, why aren't you doing this? I've been in this situation a little bit before. I was lucky enough to, for lack of a better word, eloquently defend my position, so it didn't just sound like I was some crazy jazz musician who was like inventing things from ground zero to do with 10-year-olds that were coming for piano lessons. I sent them information about Gordon's work and his research and the gimbal and all the things that show that you're not just some person with some ideas that haven't been thought out. But it can be very challenging in that position, because now not only are you're not in a friendly conversation like you mentioned would be great to have a mutual exploration of ideas in a respectful way. You're in a position where someone else has biases, who's probably talking to you because they don't like what you're doing to begin with, and now you're having to educate them in that context, and that's hard. Like how often have you seen, basically what I'm getting at is in a heated debate, it's about as rare as seeing a shooting star as seeing someone change their mind in the debate. I heard someone say that, and I think it's reasonably accurate.
Depends how dark your community is, how far away from the lights, and what time of year. So the one instance that's really front of mind for me is I stopped one job and needed to supplement my income. I needed to find another job right away. So I went to work for the public schools in the county around here, and they observed me, and they said they want me to teach the curriculum, the third grade curriculum, to the third graders. And I said, well, some of the third graders aren't ready for that, and some of them are working on a fifth grade level. And here's what the fifth graders can do. Well, these third graders can do it already. But they had somebody come in and observe me again, and then they came in and said, I'm sorry, we're going to have to put you under a personal improvement plan, because you're and I'm going to assign so-and-so who's like I don't even know what her position was, but she didn't have music as background at all, and the principal certainly didn't. And they brought somebody in who did, and they just agreed with the principal. Somebody from the county office came in, from central office came in, music, and like, oh, I agree with the principal. We worked hard on this curriculum. We want you to teach the curriculum. It's like, to who? Mm-hmm. I don't teach the curriculum. I teach the children the curriculum. It's different. I've got to have the kids. And so what became quite obvious is my only choice was to resign, because I'm not gonna basically end up in a classroom where I'm not giving music education to the kids. I'm just delivering what's on the page. It's kind of like teaching without any audiation behind it, or without any thinking behind it.
Well, and also it's a curriculum you don't believe in, because if for example, Eric hired me to run a set of classes like he does and train me to work with, younger students than I normally work with, I'd be perfectly happy just running his curriculum just verbatim, because I believe in it, so I think there's more than just following someone else's curriculum, is that you don't actually believe in what's in the curriculum. I've actually talked to many music teachers. I mean, I've talked to teachers who are in the high school band programs who know about MLT, that feel uncomfortable about having to, teach certain milestones, like certain scales or God knows what, certain rhythms by certain grades. Or there's a teacher I was talking to a couple months ago who got offered a Kodály offered a position at a school with a admin person who was very hot on Kodai, which is hilarious because like Kodai is a lot closer to MLT than standard music education. I will gladly, I think Suzuki, Kodai, or they're closer to MLT than the kind of let's learn how to decode music first. But there's still huge pedagogical differences in Kodai and MLT, and I don't doubt that you can bridge some of those gaps. But this teacher I was talking to was concerned that the administrator was so hard on Kodai that it would still be stressful to be in that environment and want to teach music learning theory, way, which is very interesting.
Yeah, well, Kodai, just frankly doesn't emphasize context. And
Sure.
Compared to, what do you want your kid growing up eating? The stuff that's only that he likes, or or a whole smorgasbord of healthy foods with candy involved too, and pie, no problem, but not as a staple. So we want those healthy diets. So why is there so limited number of contexts or patterns, or right, the So Me songs? Why is that so limiting when we know that 3 and 4-year-olds can achieve much higher degree of music achievement in terms of knowing more tonalities, more meters, and being given a quality diet as opposed to bacon and potatoes, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's where MLT becomes interesting because the barrier to entry is really high compared to a lot of other music learning systems, essentially. I mean, because if a lot of people know how to decode notation, and their kind of view is like, okay, I want my students to be able to sight read basically and play music, so let's just start there. And I mean, basically the theory is you start simple and get more complicated. I mean, that's about how complicated decoding methods are. And they have their own content, like they're going to learn major chords or major scales, and it's usually major and minor, and that's about it. And duple and triple, and then if those are done well, that is the content. And so that's the lens that gets put onto their curriculum design. But the problem having these conversations with people that aren't educated about MLT is, even if a teacher, sees the audiation light, the road to understanding MLT is not a quick one, in a sense. It's not, you're not just gonna like breeze through learning sequences and music on your lunch break and know how to do this stuff. Like, this is probably gonna take a couple of years for you to actually understand what the hell's going on, and a couple more to actually be able to implement it in the classroom in some kind of reasonable way. Not that you can't start slow, but I'm just saying it's going to take time to be realistic. And so not only is the teacher who is on board with MLT going to have a few-year process probably to fully arrive at some kind of ability to implement this consistently in the classroom, how much harder is it to convince someone in some like short 20-minute or hour conversation? It's not happening, because the things that are the lenses, or the pieces of knowledge that are giving us these different lenses about, like, well, the curriculum should have songs in different tonalities and meters, and they should learn some familiar patterns, and holy shit, patterns actually matter, and like, all this kind of stuff that can take time to convince someone of, even if they are convinciable, right?
Yeah, if they're open.
And it's very hard to change someone's mind like mid conversation about that. And so I think it's useful to give someone some charity and be like, oh, their lens is this, and it's not like they're nuts. It's just that's their lens. They've grown up seeing the benefits of people learning to sight read because they're a classical musician, and it gets them in, ensembles, and it gets them playing and practicing. But they don't necessarily I mean, we don't know what we don't know, and that's one of the reasons I try to read outside of MLT specifically, is because sometimes there's just a concept you don't know about that could totally change the way you look at something, and it's important to be absorbing,
Yeah.
new concepts. But again, this bias becomes very difficult because in the process of convincing a parent, it's not even a big deal. It's just like they gotta learn patterns and they can read them later. Like, any more questions? Here's the recordings that they should listen to while they're not in my class. But then another teacher, like, you can't say that the same way because they have all these ideas about, like, I mean, a great example is like people think that learning to decode notation should happen early because there's this theory that like getting a head start is a good idea, right? This specialization kind of mindset. But I mean, what they need a head start on is getting the patterns in their ear. More, the other stuff can come whenever, basically.
Yeah.
And so there's a real like values conflict here, and it can be difficult when someone is mandating that you cover certain. I mean, it can be difficult when someone's mandating you cover certain content. Like Engelman used to deal with this with the school systems because he would have his own DI schools that still had to follow state mandated curriculum objectives, even though they made no sense. And like, there's videos of him and people from the National Direct Instruction Institute criticizing like the curriculum requirements in like kindergarten grade 1. Like, they're so abstract and vague in some circumstances. Like, only like the top 1 or 2% of kids could even achieve these things. Like, and we have the same thing happening in music education. I mean, and Bluestein's talked about this. Like, I think it was Bluestein. I've read some articles on his site, which he's such a great writer, by the way.
Thank you, Daryl Walters.
About like curriculum that actually but about curriculum that's actually specific. Like, hey, kids can sing patterns in tonic and dominant, major and minor for at this milestone, and maybe some will be a little ahead of it and some will be a little behind. But it's actually something very specific we can ask them to do. It's not just like students play with a high degree of musicality. Like, it's so nebulous to be unusable by a teacher as an actual milestone. Or students can improvise with tonic and dominant patterns, or whatever it is.
Yeah, we gotta find a way to bridge a gap somehow. My thought is, why is not the exceptional achievement of children, like watch the video or look at these rhythm patterns, look at these melodies that the children have written, look at, show them the evidence for why you do what you do, and then, does that not persuade you because you've got the 10% or the 20% of the people who can learn the way you taught, or the way you learned, the way you were taught, and you happen to hit the gold mine of the people that can follow your track and learn to audiate on their own. That's a little bit what I did. I played the buttons, I played the notes, and then once I heard it, it's like, oh, now I understand it. So I wasn't just deciphering. Point. I was, and I would estimate, right, where I was going. But eventually I heard it enough that it got into my listening vocabulary, so I knew what I was playing. But it didn't happen for, until I could play through the piece a little bit, a few times without audiating. Mm-hmm.
Well, same thing happened to me. I mean, I had like the best music teacher personality-wise in high school. We used decoding and all that kind of stuff. And so when you look at the results he was getting with like many of the students was outstanding. And then some of the students was just like, it's fine. They're learning, but nothing particularly noteworthy in terms of audiation. But what was I doing outside of his classroom? I was listening to tons of music, and I spent an insane amount of time retrieving music from memory, basically just singing music on my own. And figuring out how to play songs by ear on multiple instruments. So I would learn how to play something on the guitar. Then I'd go learn how to play it on the piano without thinking of note names. I would just find it. Then I would sing it. Then I'd play it on the saxophone. And so you could put me like compared to another student in this guitar class in high school and say, well, his curriculum is working. Look at the results. This kid's really going for it. Not all of them are, but this kid is. But in that case, a lot of the things that were benefiting me audiation wise were not happening in the classroom. They were happening outside the classroom. And that's really hard
for sure.
I think for some student I'm
yeah,
just repeating what you said, but
I have parents
it's a big
that
issue.
come to me and they say, I wish I understood what you're teaching my 5-year-old. You know, I said, were you taught names of notes and lines and spaces? They said, yeah. And I said, did that stick? How did that work out for you? It's like, and you look at the percentage of people that stay on for more than 5 years is what, 80% or more dropout rate for lessons? So
Sure.
that's terribly frustrating for people. It's either too easy for them and they don't care because I've seen them, but mostly it's, why am I learning this information to make this terrible sound and struggle through all that, right? Those first 2 years on violin, you just don't, or 3 or 10 years on violin, you just don't sound very good to yourself or to the parents. And it's like, what is this about? What are we really getting at?
Totally. Ironically, a lot of students don't learn to do things that are like tonally, especially that are like what MLT is recommending until they go to university, if that. Some people are getting out of bachelor's programs in jazz, and it's just like the last year or two, they really started singing patterns. And that's when things, I mean, and they've been playing music their whole,
So,
let's say
so
from
there's
12
people that
to whatever.
have the intrinsic motivation and have some level of aptitude enough, or right, they're committed, they like their teacher, that helps, right? They like the sound of their instrument, that really helps. That's the number one factor for people sticking with something, is they like the timbre of the instrument. So if you've got some of those things working for you, you'll get through anything. But music learning theory is really designed to, not for the high achievers, unfortunately. I just don't, I think it moves too slow and doesn't have enough content or opportunity for faster growth for the few who are exceptional on either tonal, rhythmic, or harmonic aptitude, etc. So, but if everybody's learning and then you incorporate Engelmann with this, right, you making everybody feel like they're moving consistently in the right direction, and it's not frustrating, and you're able to feed them, easy patterns and all that stuff. But those kids take a long time sometimes too. But it's worthy of their time, because you're going to have a musician at the end, not somebody with knowledge.
Well, totally, and it's very misleading because pattern acquisition is on like an exponential curve. So at first it's absurdly slow. Each pattern takes so much just listening exposure for most people to get these patterns to be familiar. But as you have more and more patterns, the thing just takes off, and your ability to perform inferences, it just gets off the chart. And that's what I think happens with kids with high enough aptitude. For whatever reason, they had the listening exposure at a young enough age, or they were just so efficient with the exposure they had that they can absorb patterns at a faster rate than a traditional MLT curriculum can give them, especially one that doesn't have something like how Eric has, like really quick advancement in the harmonic learning sequence. I mean, a lot of those kids just get frustrated, and that's why I was frustrated in school with music education, because I was just ready for more patterns. You know what I mean? And I was hungry and looking for it outside of the classroom. But it's a weird thing. when you have high aptitude slash high achievement, you can tell that a lot of teachers don't know how to handle it. I mean, I think my band teacher handled it in a great way in the sense that he took me off saxophone and concert band, put me on saxophone and jazz band, which I think was like a genius move because he knew I could improvise and it's a strength and I liked it too, right? And so I switched to another concert band instrument just for variety. And he was like, join the jazz band, just cut loose, And guitar wise, he was always very. I had repertoire and I was learning all the standard stuff, but he was very like encouraging into what I was doing, even though he didn't have an explicit way of guiding it or framing it. But I do find this. I've mentioned this on the podcast before that the culture of guitar players is more audiation friendly in general. Like my teacher could improvise very well in like pretty much any style you could imagine. And so even though he didn't have like a MLT like fully in his vocabulary, he knew how the process of learning to improvise and I would say even audiate unfolded, and he was encouraging to the methods. And I think that was one of those cases where not only is it aptitude, I think you also have some weird natural selection at play where like I just randomly was the kind of kid who would sing songs to myself all the time. And that constant recall of patterns drives the patterns further into your long-term memory. But I'm convinced I have students that have good aptitude. When I do yes/no games with them, bang, right on. When I do comparisons with them, bang, like they get this shit all the time. But they're not really working on music in between lessons. They're not interested, or they don't practice recall, or for whatever reason. So there's some weird like natural selection built into like people's interest level coinciding with their aptitude, and whether or not they like use practice techniques that are useful. It's very interesting, and that's why I think it's so hard for teachers to not get blinded by bias, because there's all this stuff going on behind their own curriculum, interest,
for sure,
what students are doing on their own time, etc.
Kids that are in music lessons but are also playing 3 sports. They'd rather be practicing, but they've got to go to swimming.
That's what happened to me in grade 8. I was like, I don't know. I've been playing hockey since I was 4, ice hockey, but I'm running out of time to play guitar. So something's got to give here.
So parents, and then colleagues, and then bosses. Who else? So it's tricky because I just don't know that people in general are open for these kinds of conversations as often as we'd like. When you sign up for a class, you now invested your money, your time, and you go in and you sit down and it's like, okay, I better see what this is about. And so, when you got Dr. Gordon sitting there in front of you, over time it starts to seep in to the point where you go, aha, oh my God, no wonder I'm no good. or relatively underachieved.
Well, and to your point earlier about music learning theory really helping people that are struggling, I mean, for me, like, it's just accelerated how fast I can learn stuff, because now I know really what works and what doesn't. And before I would just hammer in things nonstop, and that works, right? If you sing enough patterns and play them on your instrument and listen to them, and your aptitude's fine, you can just hammer this stuff in. But I wanted to get more efficient, like with stuff. Another group of people that I think is actually really funny to talk about is other students. Or students in general, because when I get transfer students that have worked with other piano teachers, typically ones who have done the decoding thing and it's not working and all that, they're totally on board. They're like, holy shit, I'm playing music. Basically, we're actually playing music in class. But there is, once in a while, I get a transfer student who's like doing Royal Conservatory stuff, piano. They're in like grade 5 or something, and they can play pretty well, but their audiation chops are a little suspicious, and they don't like the MLT stuff. at first. A lot of them don't, because it makes them uncomfortable, because the decoding thing that they've gotten used to and skilled at even, it's not the same as me just like taking the three notes of a major scale and just being like, hey, repeat what I play.
Right.
Like, or taking a tonic chord and inverting it and flipping it backwards and hey, can you repeat this on your piano or just sing it back to me? I don't care which one you do. Those students can take a while to come around, and they usually do come around, but that's another funny circumstance that can happen instrumentally.
We didn't solve any real problems, did we?
I don't think, I think the main problem I hope to have helped people solve in their own minds is that other people definitely are coming at this from a different perspective if they're not in the MLT community. And I don't think it's realistic to try to change someone's entire paradigm of teaching music in a short conversation. And I don't even enter these conversations with the goal of doing that. My only goal leaving the conversations is to leave people with some doubts about like maybe what they're doing, and to look into it further. Because I think in the long run,
get your toe in the door is all. Just
exactly.
And encourage a conversation around it, and listen more than talk. That's probably a good thing to do.
It's a great practice.
I don't claim to have any. I'm really good at explaining it when people are ready to listen. My boss is coming around a little bit just recently, so she let me have the floor at a meeting for like 2 or 3 minutes, and I went full ballistic mode on how I teach, and I explained it like I can explain it to my 4 and 5-year-olds, and but I was so animated and so alive about, like, okay, you really want to know what I'm about? This is me, full blown. I'm on, I'm on a different team than you think I'm on, or I'm on. I want you to understand the value that when kids come from my classes and go to yours, what's happening, what are they able to do? How much of that can you take?
Yeah, for sure.
Right? And it's not fun and games. It's play, and it's not fun and games.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a topic I always like coming back to, because Eric, I know, for example, has a really well thought out and sequenced curriculum, and the play, his appeal to play is purely practical in the sense it's more fun for everybody, obviously, and it helps get the job done. But there are times, Eric, and I'm sure you've seen this, where teachers, they appeal to play as being the primary metric of whether the curriculum is working, but there's no logical sequence to the curriculum. So it's basically just playtime. And that is not what I think you're advocating at all. But that I think is really important to remind people. It's not just like Eric's like, let's just listen to songs and screw around. Like, he actually has objectives that are wired in.
And kids playing with blocks, they eventually learn different stuff by using the blocks. It's right, but you start to encourage the kids, say, hey, can you make a dinosaur playground with your blocks, or something, give them a context to use their blocks in a different way than they have been. So now they're using their imagination, and they're still trying, you're not trying to put the big blocks on top and all the little blocks on the bottom, because right. So they learn stuff through that kind of play, but it's designed to push forward what they're learning about, gravity or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, so the content you're introducing in class is designed to push forward. I mean, basically what you're providing them audiation toys that they can fuse together and mix with, and that's the fun of it.
Lots of variety of everything.
But what I find is that, like, so when a kid is like, okay, it's a music class, right? and kids are quite smart. I mean, they know the difference between music and reading a piece of paper when they're not audiating it. They know the difference between the two. And so what I hope to remind people of, and myself even, is that when you're working with content like a pattern or playing music or whatever, when you're good at that, you're good at playing a melody on the guitar, you're good at singing a pattern back, that high level of competence and mastery drives fun, because when you've mastered a piece of content, you can actually play with it more. Part of the problem with when we talk about playing with blocks, kids can see the blocks and hold up the blocks. I mean, babies are pretty useless when they're like 2 months old. They're not picking things up, but like by the time they're like 1 or whatever, their motor control is really good. They can pick things up, they can recognize shapes, and they've already done the kind of like the listening vocabulary equivalent of looking at objects, but now they're playing with the objects. But when you're an MLT teacher or you're a music teacher and you're dealing with kids who really don't have much of a listening vocabulary, you're essentially forging the blocks that they're going to be playing with. It's not like they can initially just jump in and start tonic dominant and crazy Dorian, improv and 5/8 and stuff like that. Like, you actually have to like forge these blocks in their perception for them to be able to play with. And it's one of the reasons I get so frustrated when people think like early childhood education for music is less serious than like collegiate music training, when in fact it's the exact opposite. It's the earlier stuff is profoundly more important. And Engelman said the same thing about early education with vocabulary acquisition and all kinds of stuff. We tend to think that like the early teachers can just be like messing around and having fun, but like that's the critical window where like real things are forged out of the ground. And I mean, Eric probably knows this frustration more than I think most human beings alive know.
The serious work of play, right?
Yeah. Well, and the fact that you can skillfully make it enjoyable, for people, I think that's great too.
Most of the time, I do pretty good. It's fun. I mean, dang, yeah. Why suffer? Teaching is a joy, especially when you get it right. So
yeah, definitely.
All right.
So, be nice out there to people. It's probably a good strategy.
Be careful. Be nice. All right. I agree.
All right. Good luck, everyone, with your MLT-based conversations.
Yeah, don't be afraid to start a conversation. Just go into it gently.
And we have the benefit. There is some empirical research behind this too, which I feel like can it can add some weight to the conversation. Not that you're like name dropping studies as you're trying to prove things while you're debating someone, but just when you're sending someone away with, hey, you should check out this Gordon guy. Like, he actually did quite a bit of research on what audiation is and the fact that it can improve in these windows with certain techniques and training and stuff like that. The fact that he did all that research, I think we are all benefiting from it because of the caliber of seriousness behind the thought that he put in to this work. You can show that to somebody.
Needs to be
it's not just
made accessible, more accessible than it is in the current way it reads. It's still a lot to be.
Fair enough.
A lot to be considered. All righty.
All right, till next time.